The Morris Cowley began its life in 1915 as a practical response to a problem that was strangling early British motoring. Cars were too expensive for the ordinary man. William Morris understood that Britain needed a dependable, affordable, no-nonsense vehicle, and the Cowley became his answer. Its early versions used imported American engines from Continental and later Hotchkiss, making the car unusually robust for its price point. At a time when motoring was largely a privilege reserved for wealthy, the Cowley democratized the road by delivering something that felt both attainable and respectable. This was the car that introduced thousands of families to the idea of personal transport for the very first time. Throughout the 1920s, the Cowley's identity solidified as the honest, unpretentious workhorse of British roads. It intentionally lacked the ornate touches that some rivals showcased, instead focusing on reliability, simplicity, and low running costs. Its design philosophy, solid axles, basic controls, and sturdy mechanicals, made a favorite among tradesmen, small business owners, and rural communities that needed a machine capable of enduring rough, unpaved roads. The Cowley wasn't built to impress. It was built to survive, and in doing so became one of Morris's best-selling models of the decade. As production expanded, the Cowley helped establish Morris as a powerhouse within the British automotive industry. The Cowley plant in Oxford, which would later become one of Europe's most important car factories, was a direct result of the model's immense success. The car's popularity also led to new variants, including saloons, tourers, and light commercial versions, each finding buyers who valued durability over glamour. It was during this era that the Cowley became a household name, the sort of car that needed almost no introduction, because everyone either owned one or knew someone who did. However, its success created unexpected pressure. The British market was evolving rapidly, with new styling trends, better engines, and more sophisticated interiors becoming standard on many competitors. While Morris was expanding and selling more cars than ever, the Cowley's no-frills formula began to appear dated. Consumers who had grown accustomed to reliability now wanted refinement as well, and although the Cowley evolved incrementally, it struggled to keep pace with new expectations. The model that had once been a pioneer suddenly risked being overshadowed by its own success. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, Morris found itself in a difficult balancing act. The company wanted to preserve the Cowley's identity as a budget-friendly, mechanically simple car, but also needed to meet rising standards of comfort, design, and performance. This tension created friction inside the brand's product planning, eventually contributing to a series of redesigns that moved the Cowley away from its early utilitarian spirit. Yet despite these challenges, the Cowley remained a strong seller, even as cracks began to show beneath its once unshakable reputation. The post-war era brought the Cowley back into the spotlight, but it wasn't the same world it had dominated decades earlier. Britain in the late 1940s desperately needed affordable cars, and Morris revived the Cowley nameplate to capitalize on that demand. The newly relaunched Cowley shared much of its engineering with the Morris Oxford, adopting an ethos of modernized practicality. It featured unitary construction, updated engines, and sleeker bodywork, making a considerable departure from the pre-war versions. Still, the Cowley continued to serve as the people's Morris, positioned below the Oxford as a budget-conscious option. As the 1950s progressed, the Cowley faced intense competition from other British manufacturers, such as Austin, Standard, and Ford, all of whom were improving rapidly. The Cowley began to feel increasingly squeezed between the more refined Oxford and the rising popularity of small, economical cars like the Minor. Its role in the Morris lineup became ambiguous. Too large to compete with compact cars, yet too plain to attract buyers wanting mid-size sophistication. It remained dependable and mechanically straightforward, but dependability alone was no longer enough to anchor a model's future. The formation of the British Motor Corporation, BMC, in 1952 changed the landscape dramatically. Morris and Austin were now part of the same conglomerate, and internal competition for resources became inevitable. Austin had the A40 and A50, and BMC executives increasingly favored consolidating platforms rather than maintaining overlapping models. The Cowley, once a flagship of the Morris brand, now struggled to justify its existence in a crowded and politically complex corporate environment. Each redesign became more cautious, more incremental, and more compromised by the need to fit into a shared corporate strategy. By the late 1950s, the writing was on the wall. BMC's focus shifted toward new engineering innovations like the transverse engine minicar program, spearheaded by Alex Aganis. Cars like the Mini and the upcoming 1100 represented the future, pushing the old-fashioned longitudinal engine saloons like the Cowley into obsolescence. Meanwhile, exports, once the Cowley's lifeline, began shrinking as global markets demanded more modern vehicles. The Cowley's conservative engineering, once its greatest selling point, became a liability in a world that was becoming more technologically adventurous. When production of the final Morris Cowley ended in 1958, it was less a dramatic collapse and more a quiet retreat. The model simply no longer had a clear purpose within BMC's evolving strategy. The Oxford continued with newer generations, and the Cowley name disappeared without ceremony. The car that had once defined affordable British motoring slipped into the background of history, overshadowed by the very vehicles that Morris's own company had prioritized and celebrated. Although the Morris Cowley ended its production with relatively little public attention, its legacy continued to shape British motoring for decades. The Oxford plant, built on the foundation of Cowley production, became one of the most important automotive facilities in Europe and remains active today under BMW's Mini brand. For many families, the Cowley represents the beginning of their motoring history, an introduction to travel, independence, and reliability. Its cultural impact can still be felt in the nostalgia surrounding early British cars, and the pride in a time when the UK was a powerhouse in the global automotive industry. Collectors often view the Cowley with a mixture of admiration and melancholy. Early models are celebrated for their vintage charm and engineering simplicity, while post-war versions evoke a sense of working-class determination. Yet the Cowley's disappearance from mainstream automotive consciousness happened largely because it never achieved the iconic, enthusiast-friendly status of cars like the Morris Minor or the Mini. It was too sensible, too modest, too unassuming. It fulfilled its purpose brilliantly, but lacked the charismatic spark that would keep it in the spotlight for decades. In historical analysis, the Cowley is frequently described as a victim of shifting market dynamics rather than poor engineering or bad decisions. Its decline reflects broader changes in post-war Britain, rising living standards, intensifying competition, and the increasing role of design and innovation in consumer choices. The Cowley belonged to a different era, one defined by practicality and simplicity. As tastes evolved toward style, comfort, and technological novelty, the Cowley's core strengths no longer resonated with modern buyers. The car's story also serves as a quiet commentary on the internal struggles of BMC, whose sprawling lineup often resulted in overlapping models and confused brand positioning. The Cowley was one of several Morris models caught between tradition and modernization, unable to carve out a distinct niche in a conglomerate that was both ambitious and chaotic. Its demise was not due to failure, but due to redundancy, a casualty of rationalization in a rapidly changing corporation. Today, the Morris Cowley is remembered not for how it ended, but for what it represented. The car that made driving accessible to the British middle and working classes. It is a reminder of the transformative power of simple engineering and practical design. While it no longer roams the roads in large numbers, its influence remains embedded in the foundations of the British automotive industry. The Cowley may have faded quietly, but its contribution to the story of British motoring is unmistakable and enduring.